Let's do it. All right, here we go. Donald Robertson, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
For those looking to get to know Donald a little bit better and his previous work, I direct you back to episode number 104 and 105 of Built Not Born. Donald came on last summer to discuss his epic book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. We discussed some Stoicism. Donald is back to talk about his latest book, biography of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. So I'll kick it off to you, Donald. Tell us about your new biography and what inspired you to write it.
Well, what inspired me to write it is actually the funny thing is I'd written books about Stoicism. I started writing books about Stoicism kind of before it was cool. I hate saying that, but there's no other way of saying it. Like I got into Stoicism 25 years ago, and I swear at the time, no one was interested in it. And my friends said, why are you into this weird, nerdy, niche subject that no one cares about? There were no self-help books or anything like that about it. And in the past couple of decades, it's now established itself, I would say, as a niche in the self-improvement field. There are books coming out every few months. There's blog posts, podcasts all over the place. Celebrities are into it. And so I'd already written a couple of books, and then my publisher asked me to write an introductory book on Stoicism, and I said, "Well, I'm your man. I'm happy to do that. I've been involved in teaching it and using it with clients for a long time and writing about it, but this has already been kind of done to death a little bit, and I've already done it. So we need to find a different angle." And I asked myself, how would the ancient Stoics have said we should approach teaching the subject? And I thought, well, they really believed in modeling the behavior of a teacher. They said, look, the best thing is if you could live alongside Socrates and see how he eats his breakfast in the morning, see, how he interacts with other people, how he deals with problems when they arise. Then that's the best way to really model things and learn from them. And I thought, well, okay, so the intermediate is if you write a book where you're talking about a person and describing their character and how they used Stoicism. So I thought, okay, would we write about Zeno, the founder of Stoicism? Well, there's a lot of cool stories about him, but now we're really going back quite far in history, and the sources are a little bit sketchy, inconsistent, less reliable. There's not as much. I thought, wow, like who do we know the most about? If only there was a guy that was really into Stoicism that people really love, and he was like a big deal back in the day, so that we know a lot about him. And I thought, well, Marcus Aurelius, because he's a Roman emperor, the evidence that we have for his life and character is way beyond what we have for most ancient philosophers. I think I need to double check I'm right about this, but we certainly know more about him than we do about most ancient philosophers. I think we might know more about Marcus Aurelius than any other ancient philosopher. We have not just, some of these guys, we don't know what they looked like because there are no statues of, like Epictetus, for example, the other famous Stoic. No idea what he looked like. Like there are no images of him. Marcus Aurelius, we have images of him at different stages. We know what he looked like as a kid. We know what he looked like in old age. There are many depictions of him. We have his private letters. We have his personal reflections. We have three main Roman histories of his life. So I thought there's kind of a wealth of material that we can construct his life from. And he's one of the good emperors. He's a pretty good role model in many regards. So that's what attracted me to writing about him. And now I've written 3 books in a row about him, because you mentioned How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. That was, I would say, a self-help book with bits of historical anecdotes or vignettes in it. And then I wrote a graphic novel called Verissimus about his life. And then Yale University Press, who have this series called Ancient Lives with Cleopatra and Crassus and other famous figures from history in it, they said, would you write a biography of Marcus Aurelius? And again, I thought, well, I've kind of done that to some extent. I wrote bits of his biography. I wrote a graphic novel about his life, but I've not written a prose biography. And what attracted me to it was they said, for this series, we want a different type of biography. So if you're writing an ancient biography, you can do it more in an academic style, where you say, hey, we've got these three contradictory bits of evidence, and this might be true, or this might be true, or, but we don't really know this bit of information. And that's the most objective, most fact-based way of doing it. But it's a little bit boring to read. It's usually only academics and professional historians that read those kind of books. Or you can do a more narrative style biography, where it's a bit like writing a movie screenplay. And you go, okay, we're going to base this on the historical information, but we're going to try and embellish it a little bit here and there within reasonable bounds. So we might imagine what Marcus might have said in a particular situation. If there's three contradictory versions of the stories, we'll pick one, and go with what seems most plausible rather than analyzing the relationship between them. So it's less analytic or academic and more narrative in style. And that attracted me because there's a precedent for this. One of the earliest biographers is Plutarch. One of the most influential books of all time is Plutarch's Lives. And Plutarch said that he was writing the lives partly as a historical document, but also because he wrote them in such a way that they would be really good stories and they would be engaging and they would have moral lessons contained in them. So people would benefit. Their self-help combined with biography. So I thought, I'll write a biography of Marcus if we can write it in such a way that we tell the life of his story almost like you're watching the movie Gladiator or something. It's more historically based. It is a historically accurate biography, but it's written in a more flowing, engaging, movie-like manner. And that we try and include as much of his philosophy as we can. Something that frustrated me, the other thing is, I should say, there are many biographies of Marcus Aurelius. Apart from the ancient ones, there are many modern biographies of Marcus Aurelius. So I thought, well, this has already been done. However, something that always kind of irked me a bit about them was that none of them really dig that deep into how his philosophy actually shaped his character and actions as emperor. So they'll talk more about his life and his military campaigns and stuff, and the philosophy is almost kind of an afterthought, like an appendix. And I thought that would be like telling the story of St. Augustine or some famous Christian figure historically, writing their biography and not really mentioning how Christianity and Christian values had shaped their personality and the way that they conducted their life. That's crazy. Doesn't make any sense at all to do that, right? Oh, and by the way, he's a Christian. It doesn't make any sense. It was central to his understanding his whole character. So I thought I want to write a biography of Marcus where the Stoicism is front and center. And we try really hard to think about the connections between the Stoicism and the events of his life. And that's hard work with Marcus sometimes. We have these almost two parallel stories about him. We have the story that's told by other people about his life as emperor and military campaigns and so on, that's kind of external and objective and doesn't mention Stoicism that much. It kind of touches on it a little bit. There's little traces of it. And then we have this inner journey that's described in the Meditations, which he wrote, and the story, and says very little about his military campaigns or his career as emperor, but focuses much more on his psychological and philosophical and spiritual development. So we've got the outer story and the inner story. Is there a way that we can weave them together? Because they're not originally woven together. And that's what I tried to do as much as I could in this biography.
So you mentioned balancing the facts and figures, so almost like a movie screenplay, and a little bit of an imagination of what they might be thinking. One of my favorite chapters from How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, I might be in the last chapter where you think of what Marcus was right before he died, and you think about, And I thought that was one of my favorite chapters in the book. Is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I know that's people's favorite chapter.
Such a good chapter. That was,
Right.
yeah, it's so good.
I'll tell you how I wrote that actually, because I was writing the story of Marcus's life and how to think Roman Emperor. I decided I was going to tell these little vignettes in chronological order.
Mhm.
And I, as a writer, like I'm not a great writer. I am so writer, and I have a bit of a strategy. So writing it at the outset, I thought the problem, as with many biographical stories, is that the beginning of the story is kind of not that dramatic,
Mhm.
right? However, especially for modern readers, it's even particularly in recent decades, it's really important to grab the reader right from the outset because a
Yeah.
lot of people buy books, read the first chapter, and then don't read the rest of
Don't
them
finish
these
it.
days,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Like,
Absolutely.
so you have to really capture people's attention. So your first chapter can't like drag. Um, and so I thought, well, how am I going to do that? Like, and I thought, well, one way of doing that technically is to have a framing story, and we could begin with his death. And then, so he dies in the first chapter, How to Think Roman Emperor. And then we'll go back and return to the beginning of his life and tell the story of his life. But we'll frame it with the story about his death. And I thought that works because talking about his death is very dramatic. It's easy to bring the philosophy in. We know some cool things about what happened when he was dying. And then we have his education and upbringing, which is almost like the kind of training montage in, a Rocky movie or something like that. So we then have this bit about how he was educated and stuff like that. It's kind of interesting, but it's not as dramatic.
Mhm.
And then I thought, but then I've got a problem as I was writing the book and getting towards the end of it. I thought I've left myself with a problem now, which is I don't really know how to end this book. I don't think I can return actually to this, to the original scene where he's dying. I think I kind of have to wrap that up in the first chapter. And I thought, how am I going to end this book? Because his story kind of becomes a bit anticlimactic if I'm not careful. It's going to tail off because I've put his death at the beginning. And then I thought, well, what options do I have? I thought I could tell the story of his death again. How could I tell the story of his death again? Like, that's impossible. And then I thought, well, what if I tell the story of his death from a different perspective? What other perspectives are there that we know anything about?
Mhm.
And I thought, well, his own perspective, right? So maybe chapter one is what his death looks like from the outside, like what we've got in histories. And then maybe in the final chapter, the Roman Emperor, we can talk about what he was experiencing as he was dying. So we describe the same scene from two different perspectives. And that came to me as a solution to the kind of problem of how to make
Mhm.
this narrative make sense and have a dramatic beginning and an end. Now, this creates another problem for me, which was that when I'm writing the current biography, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor, I thought I already ended the last book, How to Think Roman Emperor, by really talking a lot about his death. I used that to kind of frame things. So I can't really do that again. Like, I
Mhm.
need to make this book different. So how am I going to end this book dramatically without just focusing on his death and telling the same story? And I think I figured out a sneaky way to do that. Like, but I guess the readers will find out about that if they check the book out. But that was hard for me. I had to come up with a
Yeah.
structural idea about how do I reorganize events in his life so that we end on an interesting note and it wraps the story up neatly.
Maybe speak to the creative process. Like you have to start, like you said, the first 5, 10 pages either hooks the person or doesn't in the book.
Yeah.
You got to almost start with a bang, like in a movie. You got that opening scene's got to grab your attention, or you're going to shut the Netflix show off. And then in the middle, you got to hold their attention, but then you want to close that strong finish at the end. And that's no joke. Because I mean, like, how many books did you start and never finish? I know I'm
Yeah.
guilty of that. And even like an Audible, like I love Audible, and I'll listen to an Audible book, and when that next credit rolls around, and there's that next book that just came out from another author, if I'm not really engaged or losing interest, I'll go start the other book. Like it's
Skip it.
you want to
Yeah.
you want to skip, and maybe we could touch real quick on the creative process. Um,
Mhm.
what's your creative process look like? So when you're writing this book, like
Yeah.
what's your routine look like?
Well, it's a funny question, right? Because I never really thought about describing my creative process to people, and in some ways I didn't really think of myself as having one. And then people have asked me a couple of times about that, and I realized I guess I have quite a weird creative process, and it is kind of interesting. There's quite a lot to it. So I will I like to really research the people that I'm reading about, and I'll go to the places that they lived. So I've spent a lot of time in Athens. I'm writing a book about Socrates at the moment. I went to Carnuntum. I haven't been to Rome actually, like because of the pandemic and stuff. I was going to go, but I had to change my plans. But I spent a week in Carnuntum, where Marcus Aurelius was stationed when he was writing the Meditations. There's an amazing archaeological park there, a huge reconstructed Roman villa. And so I'll kind of try and do that. I'll visit museums, and I'll really try and imagine the lives of the people that I'm writing about. There's a lot of other kind of technical things that I do. I'll plan the book, but then I have a weird little routine where for 30 minutes, most days, like it depends what stage I'm at. I'm working on a book, but usually when I'm in the middle of writing a book, I'll do a kind of meditation exercise for 10 minutes. That's what we call the Benson method in psychotherapy, where basically you just shut your eyes and repeat a word every time you exhale in your mind. It's like a mantra. It's very repetitive. It's a little bit like transcendental meditation. So I'll do that for like a minute, 10 minutes. And then I'll do a weird little exercise where I do kind of brainstorming or something similar to that. I'll do a kind of cognitive exercise. So for instance, I might write down a statement that I want to make in a chapter that I'm working on. And then I'll brainstorm all the possible objections to it. And then I'll brainstorm all the possible responses to those objections and make like a kind of list. So I'll draw a little kind of like table, and I'll do this kind of little creative thinking, cognitive brainstorming exercise for 10 minutes, something similar to that. And then for 10 minutes, I'll shut my eyes and I'll visualize that I'm talking to the person that I'm writing about. And I'll kind of set the scene. I'll imagine I'm in Athens or Corinthian or whatever. I imagine I'm meeting Marcus Aurelius or Socrates, and I'll ask them questions. I'll talk to them. And sometimes I get interesting responses, and sometimes it just helps me focus more generally. And sometimes I get a kind of general sense of the character from doing it. Like, for example, I used to visualize Socrates every day. And the main thing I took from it is that he seemed really uninterested in historical accuracy. Like I kept saying to him, but like, what year did this thing happen in? And like, how are we going to describe this so it's accurate? And he'd be like, well, who cares? Like, he's like, he used to be more, look, what's the most important thing that you want to get across in the book? And surely, like you should be thinking more about how to teach people about wisdom or virtue or whatever. It doesn't really matter, like if the chronology is like 100% correct. So I constantly was getting this kind of input from Socrates on my overall approach. And that's kind of how I guess another key thing for me is that I write books in my mind, the strategy of audiobook first.
Yeah.
So I said this to my editor the other day, and he was like, really? Like, so I said, I'm writing an audiobook, right? That's how I approach it.
Yep.
And so I'll read a chapter out loud. I'll pay someone to read, I on every book I've worked on over the past few books anyway, like I'll pay someone maybe repeatedly we'll print out 2 copies of the whole book, and they're double line spaced or whatever, and comb bound, and they have a copy and I have a copy, and I get them like some glasses, a bottle of wine or some beer or something like that. And I'll say, okay, this is going to take all day. It takes about a day, and you're going to read the entire thing, and we'll have like a 10-minute pause between each chapter. And I'm going to go through it and I'm going to listen to it and I'm going to mark with a red pen anything that I think doesn't sound right to me, doesn't flow, anything that's repetitive or whatever. And I'll get them to give me a little bit of feedback, but their main job is just to read it to me. So I'll listen to what the book sounds like. Now some of that might seem like a bit excessive, but how do you think like the Roman Emperor sold over 250,000 copies? It's been translated into 20 languages.
Wow.
And I'll tell you a really cool thing about it. At the moment, I've just done a whole bunch of interviews in Spain for some of the main newspapers in Spain because the Spanish translation of it did so well.
Okay. Isn't Seneca from Spain, right?
Seneca's from Spain, and Marcus Aurelius's family were from Spain as well.
Okay.
Here's a bit of trivia for you. Marcus Aurelius's family estate happens to be right next door, pretty much. It's like an hour's walk or something from, which in ancient rural terms, I guess, is like your next door neighbor. Marcus's family home is right next door to Seneca's, right?
Wow.
And here's another bit of deep dive trivia. In the private letters of Fronto, he's kind of arguing with Marcus about Seneca, but we don't see Marcus's letters. We see some of Marcus's letters, but not annoyingly, not the ones where he's responding to this.
Okay.
But so we get one side of a conversation, and Fronto can't stand Seneca. By the way, right? He absolutely trashes him, and in a way that's actually kind of funny in a way. Like it's like a sick burn, like. But he's a master rhetorician. He's a master of language. And maybe he's kind of a bit envious or something. He was similar to Seneca. Seneca was, people hate it when I say this, but Seneca was to some extent a Latin sophist, as well as being a Stoic philosopher. He was a professional rhetoric tutor, and he was really a professional writer first and foremost. And then he became this kind of tutor to Nero. He didn't really teach him philosophy. He just taught him culture and speech writing. And Fronto does the same kind of thing for Marcus Aurelius. But Fronto says of Seneca that looking for pearls of wisdom in Seneca's writing would be like grubbing about in the bottom of a sewer through the filth, looking for 2 or 3 silver coins, is how he describes reading Seneca.
That's crazy.
Wow, that's the only like a professional rhetorician could just come up with an insult as scathing as that and as vivid. So we're like, what did Marcus say in response? But we don't have Marcus. I'd love to know what Marcus said in response to that. But Fronto says, and this is what it's like writing a history or a biography, right? So one thing when you're writing about something that a lot of other people have written about, and you think, well, it's not like we can go up and often dig up more evidence, right? We've got quite a lot of evidence, but it's been sifted through to death. So what can you do? The only thing you can do with it is try and take the same ingredients but make a different cake from it, and look for subtle things that other people have overlooked, or try and write about it from a different perspective. And I think I managed to do that in this book. But for instance, the sort of subtlety that fascinates biographers is Fronto says to Marcus, he says something about, he says, with regard to your Seneca, right? He says your Seneca, which is interesting. So a lot of people have assumed that he means because Seneca's a Stoic and you're a Stoic. So that's why he phrases it like that. But it might be that he says your Seneca because Seneca was some kind of Seneca's family and Marcus's family were neighbors, and maybe had some sort of, annoyingly, there's no reference to that, but we know if we look at a map, we can see they lived right next door to each other. So that might be why Fronto refers to him as your Seneca. You guys are both from Hispania. Your neighbor, that guy that comes from your neck of the woods.
A couple things. So one just broad question. From Nero to Marcus, how many years is there? Like, what separates them?
Nero's reign, was it like 50 AD, roughly? So like about a century apart. Between their reigns, roughly a century.
Just a couple questions I wrote down as you're speaking. One, Fronto, his letters, how did they survive? Like, how do we still have
Well,
them?
now we're getting into a deep dive into something that's not Stoicism, but a bit of trivia about history. So many ancient manuscripts are preserved because in the ancient world, the paper that people wrote on was precious. And so they would recycle it.
Mhm.
I think they somehow bleached the paper, removed the ink, and then they would write on it again. Okay. They recycled paper. So it's possible to identify what the original writing was underneath what was written on top of it, right? And my belief is, as I recall, it was an Italian scholar in the middle of the 19th century, I think, called Angelo May, who rediscovered Fronto's letters, and they were rediscovered using this method where they found that they were on sheets of paper that something else had been written on top of.
Whoa, that's so
Like, so
cool.
almost like, when you're a kid and you have like a spy set and you
Yeah,
have
yeah.
invisible ink,
Yep.
right? It's kind of like, right, uncovering a message in invisible ink. So they like uncover the writing that was underneath. And so they discovered a whole cache. Gosh, I don't know how many. I mean, again, I'm just speaking very roughly from memory, but I guess roughly 100 letters or something like that. And they're from Fronto. Most of them are to Marcus Aurelius and from Marcus Aurelius, but some of them are to people like Marcus Aurelius's mum, his brother or adoptive brother, one of his generals, maybe a couple of other people that were involved in their kind of circle of friends. So that gives us an amazing, I mean, as if the Meditations wasn't amazing enough. When I wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, some people would say, well, that's ridiculous. Like, how would you know how a Roman emperor thinks? And I thought, well, because Marcus Aurelius literally tells us exactly how he thinks.
You're in his
He
mind with
wrote
that
an
journal. Oh my
entire
God.
book, yeah, like where he describes exactly how he's thinking about problems that he's facing. And that's exactly what the appeal of it. He tells us, shows us how he's thinking about problems. But so we've got this amazing window into Marcus Aurelius's soul or mind, but in his private cache of letters, which are actually of not that much interest to people that are into Stoicism or philosophy. They mention philosophy like fleetingly a few times, but don't really say that much about it. There's a lot of trivia. There's a lot of, I mean, the first thing, it gives you an amazing insight into what the private life of a Roman emperor or Caesar was actually like. It's I mean, if you think, well, we've got these histories and we've got all the statues, but what was it like on a day-to-day basis? Like, what did these guys actually feel like? The letters tear that wide open. That's like literally the letters that he's writing to his friends and what they're writing. And what they write a lot about is incredibly quite trivial stuff, like you'd sort of think mundane things. Like Fronto goes on a lot about his gout
Mhm.
and how he's got a gammy leg and he's not feeling very well. And Marcus will have a cold and he hasn't been sleeping well the night before. There's a lot of these two guys kind of complaining about their various ailments.
You guys just
Um,
complaining to each other. That's awesome.
yeah,
Sitting in
and
a
kind of
bar.
little bits of trivia like, oh, where they went on holiday. There's an amazing one where Marcus wishes Fronto happy birthday and writes him a kind of birthday card. But it's quite philosophical and it's beautiful. It's a rhetorical exercise. It's very beautifully written, like a little kind of a little piece of like a little poem almost, honoring him on his birthday. And then there's other weird things that are like a farce. There's a bit where Marcus's sister has period pains, and he says that she was freaking out. Here's ancient history for you. Like she had pain in her abdomen, and most people assume she had some kind of period pains or something like that. But who knows? It could maybe be something else. But she had pain downstairs and was kind of having a terrible time and freaking out. And he said his mum was freaking out even more than she was. And she ran into the side of a piece of furniture and really hurt herself because she's running around the room freaking out. Right? And then he said he has to kind of calm them down. And then after all this, he goes to go to bed and he pulls back the covers on his bed and there's a scorpion in it. Like, and so he was lucky he spotted it in time and got it out of his bed. And so this is one of his letters, right? Just
Wow.
it's like a weird farce or something, but it makes him seem real. He's like just, goofing around a bit and getting in minor squabbles with his in-laws and worrying about. Fronto tells him he's a workaholic and he needs to take more holidays. I mean, some people love these kind of minutiae. The strange thing is, the more trivial it is, the more it often makes these characters seem like real people.
Yeah. I think that's why the meditations hits like it's so relevant today. When he writes that, like everyone can connect to that. Like you're prepared to meet those rude, angry
Yeah.
people throughout the course of the day. Those quotes like that. It's almost like a tech CEO could write that in Silicon Valley in the United States, right? Like it's so relatable because it's like the human condition, which is timeless, right?
Well, let's talk about the writing style. I mean, one whole subject we can talk about in a way is the style of the meditations. It's kind of an unusual book. So, one of the reasons it's lasted so long, a couple of things, is that it's written in what I would describe as an artfully vague style.
Mm-hmm.
So it's frustrating as a biographer or historian because throughout the meditations, there are kind of scattered references to real people and real events, but they're generally really unsatisfying from a historical point of view. So he mentions the plague, which was a big deal. There was an Antonine plague was
Yep.
killing millions of Romans at the time, but he only mentions it in passing once in order to say, even though this is really bad, the plague of moral corruption that affects men's souls is even worse. And you think, dude, hey, go back up a bit, tell us more about the actual plague, though.
Yeah.
Like, so he's often mentioning these things in passing so fleetingly and
Yeah.
so vaguely. Book one, he has a list of 17 people that he admires. And so he tells us some really interesting things about them, but he confines it to the qualities that he admires in them. And so you think that's great, but could you maybe tell us when you knew these people and what they did for a living and, like other historical stuff? So from a biographer's point of view, the meditations is kind of frustrating because there's a kind of abstractness or vagueness about it. So
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned the most famous passage in the whole book is Meditations 2.1, the beginning of chapter 2, because chapter 1 is him praising his role models. They're all family members, and the only woman that he praises is his mother, incidentally. And then book 2 is where he begins the actual exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And the opening passage says, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to meet deceitful, arrogant, meddling people, and so on, right? He doesn't name them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back up. You think these are his personal notes. Why doesn't he say, every morning, tell yourself when you wake up, you're going to meet another one of those Germanic tribal chieftains and their envoys that are a complete pain in the backside, and that senator like that you can't stand. So he doesn't say that. He says it in the most abstract, generic terms. And that's why it's lasted nearly 2,000 years, because people read it today and he says that arrogant, deceitful person, and Joe Bloggs reads that and thinks that's my mother-in-law, or they think
Yeah.
that's that guy that sits across from me in
Yeah.
the office, or like that's one of my friends is a bit like that, right? So we project ourselves into the
Mm-hmm.
meditations because somehow he's written it in such a way that it's vague enough
Mm-hmm.
that it's easy for readers to put themselves in it, even though at the same time he does drop in a few vague references to Emperor Hadrian or his adopted brother or things like that. It's
Yeah.
still
And,
written in a surprisingly
and
vague,
yeah,
ahistorical way.
two questions about that. So Hadrian puts him on the throne, and it sounds
Yes.
like in the Fronto letters, he reads Seneca. So two questions there, I'll put them together.
Okay.
One, Seneca is not mentioned at all in the meditations,
No,
right? How's that possible? He definitely read Seneca and he
that's a
used,
big deal.
yeah. How's that possible?
Because the Romans have this thing called damnatio memoriae, which is so let me back up and I'll answer that in a slightly roundabout way. Today we have microwave ovens and drones and the internet, and the Romans didn't have those. So we think we're kind of a big deal, and we're much smarter than the Romans because we have these things, right?
Mhm.
But let me tell you, the Romans, educated Romans anyway, were a lot smarter than the average educated person today
Mhm.
in many other regards. So a simple example is you could imagine someone in another culture might be way better at mental arithmetic
Mhm.
than people typically are in our culture, even if they lived like 1,000 years ago, right? Perhaps if it was a big part of what they did. Romans were obsessed with rhetoric, like persuasion and communication skills,
Mhm.
and they were far on a different level, like from the majority of people today when it comes to understanding, at least educated Romans. Marcus studied rhetoric in Greek and Latin
Mhm.
with, around about half a dozen main tutors. He attended lectures from the leading rhetoricians in the world. He constantly was doing these written exercises to improve his use of language throughout most of his life. So he's a master of verbal rhetoric. And in Roman society, for example, if you don't mention someone or something, it's more obviously a slight than it would be today. And a really good example of that is in book one of the Meditations. There are people that Marcus knew. Actually, we'll back up to Hadrian, then I'll come back to Seneca again. Marcus talks a lot about the Emperor Antoninus Pius.
Mhm.
He says more about him than he does about anyone else, right?
Mhm.
Now, to a Roman immediately, that would suggest he's placing a lot of importance. This is an important guy, right? Obviously. And that would be the case. Marcus idolized this guy. He was his adopted father. He was an emperor. Like he was a big deal. So he writes way more about him than he does about anyone else. Second to that, just in terms of sheer word count, comes Junius Rusticus, Marcus's Stoic tutor. So you can say there's some solid evidence there that Marcus thinks his Stoic tutor is like the second most important guy in his life next to his adoptive father. But he doesn't mention Hadrian at all in that section because so a Roman reading that immediately. I mean, we would maybe think this, but we'd stop and scratch our heads, and some people would think this, other people wouldn't notice it. Most educated Romans immediately would think he has nothing positive to say about
Mhm.
Emperor Hadrian. Like that's a scathing insult. To leave him out,
Yeah.
like, is deeply insulting. And in fact, I would say maybe this is subjective, but I think when I explain this to people, usually they end up agreeing with me that if you look closely at what he says about Antoninus Pius, a lot of the things he says really sound like they're implicit criticisms of Hadrian. And so this is also very common in Roman oratory. If you want to really slag someone off, one typical Roman way of doing it is to praise someone else.
Mhm.
Like if you praise the new emperor and say he's incredibly well educated and he's incredibly just, everyone listening to it thinks that means that you think that the previous emperor is
Wow.
ignorant and cruel.
Mhm.
And Romans are far more kind of tuned into stuff like that than we are today. So we
Mhm.
can read the Meditations with that in mind and think it's scathing that he doesn't mention Hadrian. And even worse, he mentions him about 4 times later in the book, but he only uses him as an example of a kind of memento mori. He says, think of all the people that were really famous and really
Mhm.
wealthy and powerful, and
Yep.
now they're just dust.
Gone.
And for example, Hadrian, you think if that's all that you have to say about him,
Yeah.
that's scathing. Now, Fronto is a much more oily character than Marcus, as maybe you would suspect of a senator and a rhetorician. And what he says about Hadrian is that he heaped praise on Hadrian while he was alive. And then after he died, Fronto said, I only did that because not out of love, but out of fear. And he compares Hadrian to the god Hades and the god Mars Gravidas, who's the god of war, or specifically marching into battle. And these are gods that you fear rather than love.
Mhm.
So Fronto says that's a very dark thing to say, particularly to compare him to Hades, because Hades also is the king of the underworld. to the Greek or the Roman mind, it's comparing Hadrian to a kind of to a tyrant in a sense. He's a king, he's a ruler, but he's a ruler over the underworld, and he's a frightening figure. And also, interestingly, the Romans thought it was generally unlucky in the Greeks to mention Hades. Like it was kind of bad luck to even talk about him. So this is how Fronto feels about Hadrian. So that's an interesting part of Marcus's backstory. Another part of that's kind of interesting is that many people, even people who think they know about Roman history, will say Marcus Aurelius didn't know Hadrian, he didn't have anything to do with Hadrian, right? And I think so there's a tendency to massively underestimate how much influence Hadrian had on Marcus. It was Hadrian that chose Marcus to be his successor. He planned a long-term succession strategy. So he appointed Antoninus Pius as his Caesar and successor on condition that Antoninus would then appoint Marcus as his successor. But it was Hadrian that planned that and arranged it. So he did pick out Marcus Aurelius. And from an early age, Hadrian groomed Marcus Aurelius to be a future emperor. He constantly appointed him to important offices, even as a youth in Roman society. And he made sure that he was prepared to, have all the education and training that he would need to become a future emperor. And towards the end of his life, I think in the last 4 or 5 months of Hadrian's life, he ordered Marcus to come and live in his villa with him when Marcus would have been about 15 years old, roughly. And I think Marcus hated this because Hadrian was crazy towards the end, and he's quite a frightening man on many levels.
Isn't there a story of him like poking his secretary's eye out with a pen or something like that?
He stabbed a slave in the eye with a metal stylus because he just lost his temper with this guy. And then he felt bad about it afterwards. And he said, look, I'm really sorry. I'm the emperor. Like, is there anything I can do to make it up to you? And the guy allegedly said, all that I want is my eye back. And the moral of the story is that even Hadrian couldn't repair the damage that he did. He's like, I can't give you your eye back. I'm sorry. I'll give you some money. Well, give you some nice clothes or something. Like, I can't fix your eye, buddy. Like, so sometimes even if you're the most powerful man in the world, you can't repair the damage that you've done in a moment of anger. So Hadrian's interesting. So come back to Seneca. All right. Why does Marcus not mention Seneca? Now, one possible explanation, and it's going to be an odd explanation, but it's a good bit of trivia to know. Marcus is writing in Greek. Cicero was the first major Roman thinker to translate Greek philosophy into Latin. And then about 50, or about 100 years later, so 50 to 100 years later, Seneca starts writing Stoic philosophy in Latin. But generally speaking, that didn't catch on. And most philosophy was done still in Greek. It was a technical language philosophy. Marcus's family were really into Greek literature and culture. They were bilingual in Greek. And Marcus was fluent in Greek. And so he writes the Meditations in Greek. Now, for some weird reason that we don't fully understand, Roman authors who write in Greek very often don't quote authors that wrote in Latin. So that's sometimes been forwarded as an explanation for why Marcus never mentions Seneca anywhere in the Meditations. And it's not that he hasn't read him, because Fronto's letters make it clear that Marcus has been reading Seneca. But interestingly, he's been reading him probably in collaboration with Fronto as part of his Latin rhetoric training. He's studying Latin. So he's reading Seneca and Cicero and Lucretius, incidentally, as part of those studies. Now, people get really upset about this because a lot of people really love Seneca. But in all honesty, Seneca was a controversial figure during his lifetime, as you might expect, because he was not only the teacher, but really the right-hand man, main cheerleader, speechwriter, and supporter of Emperor Nero. He was kind of like his deputy. And not only that, his propagandist. And you might think, well, maybe the Stoics were trying to sort Nero out and moderate his craziness. But there was a famous faction of Stoics in the Senate called the Stoic Opposition by historians who defied Nero and protested against him because they thought he was a cruel dictator and a maniac and a murderer. And so these guys seem to have seen themselves as despite the fact they are Stoics and Seneca's a Stoic, they seem to have viewed themselves as being on an opposing side politically from Seneca. And Marcus mentions the members of the Stoic opposition, right? So funnily enough, he does mention famous Stoics from Nero's reign, just not Seneca. He mentions the other guys.
Yep.
Epictetus, who Marcus is a fanboy for, like he idolizes Epictetus and had probably read more of Epictetus's works than we have. There's some evidence of that. We have 4 volumes of discourses from Epictetus, but some of our sources tell us that they were originally 8 volumes.
Oh, really? Wow.
Marcus quotes from some of the volumes that we have, but he also attributes quotes to Epictetus that we don't have. And so it's possible that Marcus had read the 4 missing volumes of Epictetus. But Epictetus was alive during the reign of Nero, and he was actually purchased as a slave by Nero's Greek secretary, a guy called Epaphroditus, right? Also, Epaphroditus was the guy that instigated the political purge that led to Seneca's execution, right? So Epictetus is really pretty closely tied in with all the drama that went on surrounding Seneca's death and the opposition to him. So you might think, well, it'll be interesting to know what Epictetus says about that. Like, again, he's probably going to be kind of oblique about it. Epictetus never mentions Seneca either. He absolutely idolizes the Stoic opposition, though, that opposed Nero and Seneca. So if you read between the lines, we don't know for certain, but I think it's a fair guess that Epictetus and Marcus both saw themselves as siding with a faction of Stoics that were heavily critical of Seneca for the political stance that he took. Now, one of the reasons that people get so upset about that today is that we mainly know Seneca through his moral letters or his letters to Lucilius. And they're really good examples of Stoicism. Right?
And they're so well written. Like you could
amazing.
Like, you can wear out 3 highlighters in that book. Like that book, there's today, like you could read it and it's like, that is exactly what I needed to read today. You know, it hits you right on the spot, right?
Right. But that wasn't the only thing that Seneca wrote. Seneca wrote lots of political speeches and they don't survive. There's 1 or 2. So Seneca could be quite cruel, sarcastic, and also he was an incredible, massive sycophant, right? I hate to break it to people. And for instance, he wrote a satire ridiculing the Emperor Claudius after having sucked up to him. When the guy died, he wrote a satire kind of ridiculing him. And then he also wrote 1 letter or speech that we have surviving today called On Clemency, which is addressed to Nero. And although it does urge Nero to be more merciful, so there's some good stoicism in there, and Seneca trying to moderate Nero, it also says that Nero is completely blameless of any guilt for anyone's death, and that he's a virtual philosopher king, which would have had the senators at the time like gagging and like slightly sick in their mouth or rolling about in the aisles of the Senate laughing at how absurd it would have been to claim that Nero was this kind of paragon of virtue. You know, it's propaganda, and it is ludicrous propaganda because Nero had just murdered his little brother like not long before that speech was writing, and after it he went on to murder his mum as well. And then eventually, when he was done with that, he had Seneca killed and a bunch of other people, right? So for Seneca to say, I know he was a nut, right? Now, I know that, again, people get really angry about this on the internet. They'll say, but recently some historians have said that Nero gets a raw deal
Yeah.
and he wasn't. I don't agree with them, though. Like, I think, sure, like, historians are always trying to push revisionist stories because it's novel and it's interesting, but it's not really, often they're not plausible, though. I think the historical evidence shows it's clear that Epictetus, who was not a senator and was a contemporary of Nero, thinks that Nero was a horrible, wretched, vicious human being, like, and a terrible emperor, right? So sometimes they'll say, oh, it was only senators that were opposed to him politically, and only people generations later that made Nero out to be a tyrant. No, Epictetus was a slave, and he knew him, and he thought he was a tyrant, right? That's hard to miss. Marcus uses Nero as an example of a vicious tyrant as well. Like, so I don't. There are many other reasons to think that Nero probably was pretty bad. Maybe he wasn't as bad as he's made out to be, but he was certainly, people thought he was one of the worst emperors.
Yeah.
He was terrible. Now, I mentioned the Damnatio Memoriae, which is basically this practice of saying, let's never mention that guy's name ever again in Roman society. And sometimes it extends to scratching their name off of inscriptions and removing it from books and stuff like that. Like, so we're going to delete you from history. We talk about cancel culture, right? The Romans had cancel culture. They would literally erase your name from history. Now, this may or may not be true, right? However, I put it out there, I think people should be aware of it if they're trying to figure out what's going on with Seneca. Cassius Dio, who is a Roman senator and a historian, who was a senator under Commodus, and one of our main sources for this period in Roman history, says that the leader of the Stoic opposition, Thrasea, said of the people who collaborated with Nero, he said, let their names never be mentioned again, unless it's to say that even though they sucked up to Nero, they ended up getting executed the same as his opponents. So they didn't even achieve the thing that they were trying to achieve. They didn't even save their skins by sucking up to this guy. And that's the only time we're ever going to mention them, is to say, and they got executed anyway, right? Now, he doesn't name Seneca, but I think Seneca is clearly, without a shadow of doubt, the most obvious candidate. There's no way that he didn't have Seneca in mind when he's saying that. He would be by far and away the most obvious. He was speechwriter and his number one cheerleader and his right-hand man at the time. And he did get executed. So he fits perfectly. In that case, one of the most prominent Stoics is advocating for a damnatio memoriae of Seneca, right? Which would explain why no subsequent Stoic writings mention Nero's name. So we do have some other fragments of Stoic writings in addition to Marcus and Epictetus. None of them mention Seneca anywhere, even though we know that certainly in Marcus's case, he's read him, and Epictetus's case, he quite possibly knew him. He certainly was part of the same circle. He was the slave of the guy who initially brought the charges against Seneca. So it's a lot of drama there, but I think, these guys, I do think they had a dislike politically for Seneca. And people won't like this either, right? I love Seneca's writings. I've read them cover to cover many times, and I think everyone should read them. However, I don't think that people who were contemporary with Seneca necessarily held his writings in the same esteem. People, for start, didn't like his writing style at first. They thought it was disjointed, which it is. Like, Seneca's not good at constructing arguments. What he's really good at is writing aphorisms. That he says pithy things. He's good at tweets.
He'd be a killer on Twitter. He would be a boss on Twitter.
He'd be a boss. There are many really pithy sayings that come down through history that everyone remembers. because they come from Seneca. But in Roman society, that was seen as being not good writing. Compared to Cicero, the other famous Latin writer in philosophy, Cicero writes very like elegant, like long, complex arguments. Seneca's writings falls very far short of that standard, and that was the Roman ideal. Although, but I think it's great, and I love writing it because I like tweets and sound bites and stuff like that. So we read Seneca and we think, wow, Seneca's saying all these really profound things about Stoicism. But many other writers of the period say things that are very similar to that. And often what they're doing is recycling quotes from earlier authors, right? So I don't know that much of, and certainly in some cases, we know that Seneca is basing what he's writing very closely on earlier Stoic texts that he's reading. And there are also definitely passages in Seneca that we find echoed in other Stoic texts. So that indicates that they're probably drawing them, paraphrasing an earlier source. So it may be people at the time thought Seneca's writing's interesting. He's good at writing aphorisms, but a lot of this is kind of recycled from other books, perhaps. And that might be why Fronto gets away with saying you might as well just grub around in the bottom of a sewer for a handful of silver coins, because he thinks you can get this stuff from Dio Chrysostom or like loads of other rhetoricians that write about philosophy. So that's a harsh. I'm putting that out there just as there is this possible. As someone who reads history, and the classics, I think of course I suspend judgment a lot more than that. So I think you could interpret the evidence this way, or you could interpret it another way. But with Seneca, what I find is people aren't aware of what the relevant bits of evidence are. And also because they just like him, they like his books, they tend to be very biased in favor of a particular reading. So the critical interpretation never gets mentioned by anyone, or it kind of gets shot down in flames. And I think if we want to be objective about it, we'd go, there's two possible versions of this story that we can tell. One is that Seneca is a really virtuous guy and he's trying to moderate Nero, and the other one is that Seneca's a bit of a sellout and the other Stoics think he's mainly writing propaganda, and then so they decide to cancel him.
The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? It's probably a little bit of each.
Usually it's somewhere in between.
One of my favorite, you talk about aphorisms and quotes. The one with Seneca, you just say, tell me about Seneca or give me a quote. I love the one, we suffer more in imagination than reality. I love that. It's so good.
I like he says, to learn how to die is to unlearn how to be a slave. I love Seneca. Like, I love his writings. I don't know what I'd think of him as I wrote a biography of Seneca once, and I really, I guess it struck me that there are actually many more questions that one of them, just as an interesting bit of trivia. I mention this because when I wrote the biography for the capstone edition of his letters, I wrote a biographical essay about him. And I started it by saying, look, Seneca absolutely is a guy who manufactured his own public image, right? There's reason to question the image that he's put a lot of effort into constructing for himself, right? So out the gate, he's a professional writer. He's a rhetorician. He's a master of PR, basically. So we have to be a little bit wary about taking in the way that he constructs his story. He's clearly biased, so we have to be a little bit wary about that. But a good illustration of that is all over the internet, you'll find fake philosophy quotes. It's absolutely awash with them. And, or to be more accurate, they're usually misattributed. Some of them are just completely made up, but mostly they're misattributed quotes. So it'll be something a Christian theologian said in the 19th century, and people attribute it to Socrates. Right? And then it becomes everywhere, blogs, like you see these things all the time. But also all over the internet, there are misattributed sculptures. So I saw a book on Stoicism that someone had brought out the other day, and the cover of it, it's got a bust of Epicurus who was the head of an opposing school to the Stoics. And this is a thing on the internet that for some reason, somebody at some point thought that this sculpture was Epictetus. And then it kind of stuck and it spread everywhere. So now it's even on the cover of books and things. It's the wrong guy, though. It's not Epictetus, it's Epicurus. Now, with Seneca, there's an even more interesting story. So there was a bust found of a guy who's kind of twisting his head to one side, and he's got a long beard, longish beard. And for a Roman, it's unusual because his hair is quite unkempt and his beard is not neatly trimmed. So he's kind of scruffy looking for a Roman. And he's in this kind of anguished position and he looks a little bit emaciated, right? It's kind of odd sculpture. You've probably seen it all over the internet. And people believed it was Seneca because Seneca talks about fasting and like this kind of austere life and stuff like that. And so people who read the letters of Seneca imagined Seneca's like this anguished, emo, like looking, disaffected poet type guy. And he's probably thin and he's probably got a long beard and stuff like that. Like some sort of like a wizard or something, a philosopher. Like they had this image of him.
Yeah.
And actually, there was no reason to believe whatsoever that this was Seneca. I'm not sure. I can't remember who it is that they think it's a bust of now. We're not sure, but it's not Seneca. And we know that because decades later, another bust was found in Rome, and it's of a chubby senator with kind of pursed lips and little beady eyes, and he's clean shaven, right? Which is interesting, is more interesting than it might seem at first because it's slightly unusual for a philosopher, right? To philosophers at the time, that would make him kind of look a bit like a non-philosopher, really. Most philosophers did have beards. It was a mark of Epictetus, weirdly goes on about this. He refuses to shave his beard off, even though the Emperor Domitian ordered philosophers to shave their beards, right, as a kind of symbolic gesture. Epictetus says, if you want to cut off my beard, you'll have to cut off my head first. That's how strongly he felt about it, right?
Whoa.
It's fighting talk, right? But Seneca shaved his beard off, which is kind of a little bit odd, so bit of trivia. But he's a jowly, he looks like a fat cat, wealthy, elite senator. Basically, he definitely doesn't look like the statue that we now call pseudo Seneca. These are two completely opposite looking guys. I think just the fact that they're so different tells us that Seneca constructed this image that people bought into and identified with the sculpture, and it turns out it's nothing like what he physically looked like in real life. And I think that's just a symbol, in a way, of the extent to which he was constructing an image for himself and trying to salvage his reputation in some ways in the wake of his association with Nero and various other scandals in Roman society, I think. But that's an interesting bit of trivia. So when people are out there, they can keep an eye out for these bogus statues. You can look that up, actually. I think there's even a Wikipedia page on it. It's called Pseudo Seneca. And you'll see it on many book covers and stuff.
I just Googled Seneca now. I just Googled Seneca images and they're all over the place. So from a short, fat guy to one looks like a model to one that looks like Socrates almost. He has like
the guy with the beard that's all kind of scraggly and stuff.
Yeah. Right? It's all over the place. I mean,
then the real Seneca probably looks, there was that. Let's go now into a bit more pop culture. Funnily enough, we'll segue into John Malkovich, right? Because John Malkovich made a movie recently about Seneca, and everybody hated it except me. Right, I liked it. I thought it was pretty cool. It was a little bit art house, and I think it freaked out a lot of people who are into Seneca because it wasn't really what they were expecting to see. Now, number one, it portrays Seneca as being a bit of something of a sycophant and a political maneuverer. It shows him in the presence of Nero. It's difficult to imagine Seneca in the presence of Nero and not see him as being tainted somewhat by association with this lunatic despot.
Yeah.
The fact is, if you try to make a movie about Seneca, you put him in the same room with Nero, it's going to be a challenge because Seneca never mentions Nero in his letters. right? He doesn't talk about the time that he spent working. So he paints this picture of himself where he removes himself from that context deliberately to try and kind of like salvage his image. So we have that PR image of Seneca as this philosopher. He's off doing other stuff. But if we try and put him back in his context in Roman society, we're like, oh yeah, he was like constantly writing speeches defending this lunatic and kind of like collaborating with him, and he's just basically his chief of staff or his right hand man, or whatever. That doesn't, yeah, I've forgotten about that. But in the movie, John Malkovich, apart from the fact he's kind of a bit thinner, but he does actually look a bit. He's clean shaven, he's bald. He looks a bit like the real bust of Seneca, basically. And I think the other thing that shocks people about that movie is it kind of begins, I think, in the first act. They have a story within a story. They have a play, which is Seneca's Thyestes. And I think a lot of people who read Seneca don't maybe fully realize that Seneca was famous as well, he wrote many plays. We don't know how well known they were during his lifetime. It's believed that Shakespeare read them and was very, very influenced by them. But Seneca was a playwright, and his plays contain some Stoic philosophy, but they're also like Greek tragedies. They're very graphic and kind of a bit surreal. So I think people confronted with the Thyestes, which is a story about a father that's tricked into eating a pie that contains the cooked bodies of his murdered sons. So it's a story about kind of cannibal. It's like something out of Saw movie,
Crazy.
right? And the kind of tragedy of this and the insanity of it and stuff like that. I think a lot of viewers were a bit like, what the hell am I watching? And what has this got to do with Stoicism? But that 100%, this is Seneca. Like, he wrote this play and he wrote many other things similar to it. And it would have probably been performed by actors wearing masks. And, Roman society could be kind of surreal by modern standards. So I think that movie was better, way better than people give it credit for being. But while we're on the subject of movies, I think sometimes people ask me, why is there a modern resurgence of interest in Stoicism? Now, there are many reasons for that I could go through. But one of the most trivial reasons for it is that about 24 years ago, it's a long time now, makes me feel old, right? A movie came out called Gladiator.
So
Right?
good.
And Gladiator was huge.
So good.
People thought Swords and Sandals movies were defunct. Like, who's going to want to go to the cinema and watch a Sword and Sandals epic? Like, they just don't work anymore, people thought. And then Gladiator rewrote that, like it challenged that, and it was a massive, massive. It was a lightning in a bottle movie. But Marcus Aurelius features prominently, played by Richard Harris, in the first act of that movie. And I met many people who loved Gladiator, and they went and looked up, who is this Marcus Aurelius dude? And they read the meditations, and they were all guys who had never read any classics or history, were telling me they were reading the meditations because they'd seen the movie Gladiator.
Yeah.
Now, as you may know, Gladiator, for a long time, Ridley Scott and the studios have been trying to figure out a way to make a sequel to Gladiator. And Nick Cave, the musician, even wrote a script, which apparently was like really surreal and kind of unfilmable. But it's on the internet, actually, his screenplay for Gladiator 2, his abandoned screenplay. But they've just wrapped filming. They've just finished filming Gladiator 2. We know very little about it. Now, it's going to be more historical fiction. People tell me that Gladiator isn't real. Of course it's not. The thing that offends me most about Gladiator are the trees in it, actually, incidentally. Like, the forest doesn't looks weird to me.
Really?
But it's historical fiction, right? But some of the bits of it that people think are not accurate are actually at least loosely related to history in ways that people don't even realize. Like, so the character of Maximus, it happens to be similar in some ways to a guy called Tiberius Pompeianus, who was Marcus Aurelius's son-in-law, and he wanted him to become his successor. as an alternative to Commodus. He was his most senior general on the Northern Front. Sound familiar? Like he's very similar. I mean, there's many other differences. These things aren't completely unconnected to history. They're kind of loosely based by things that are there in history. And there are even some one or two passing references to Stoic philosophy in Gladiator. Now, Gladiator 2 is the story of Marcus Aurelius' grandson. So there's a little boy, I guess he's like 10 or something. There's a young boy at the end of Gladiator. He's Lucilla's son, therefore Marcus Aurelius' grandson. And he's a fictional character. He's called Lucius in the movie. So my understanding is that Gladiator 2 is about the grandson, is about this character growing up. So this would be the fictional grandson of Marcus Aurelius. Now, this is a kind of Hail Mary or like touch wood. You know, I'm hoping that because it's centered on Marcus Aurelius' grandson, and because they know that Stoicism since then has become quite popular, maybe, just maybe, they might refer to the fact that his grandfather was Marcus Aurelius, and they might make some kind of passing references to Stoicism. So who knows? It might be that this movie's rubbish, you know, and it's kind of like, you know, that it falls into the category of a sequel they should never have made. I think a lot of people are kind of like, oh, it's going to be, but I'm hopeful that it might be good.
Yeah.
And I'm also hopeful that there might again be some reference to Marcus Aurelius and some allusions to Stoicism, and it may be, and that might inspire another generation of moviegoers to think, who's this Marcus Aurelius guy that they keep mentioning in this movie?
Yeah. Like
Because the
another,
Seneca movie didn't.
yeah, like another way to bring more people to the meditations and into Stoic philosophy. Two random things. You mentioned evidence. I read an article in Pompeii where they're finding these scrolls that are charred, and there's a computer, a way that they can scan them now and read the documents they couldn't before.
Yeah.
With that, can you see maybe one day finding the other four Epictetus books or something Seneca wrote that's undiscovered yet? Can you see some big discoveries coming from that?
See, it's rare now that we discover lost classical texts, right? It has to be said. It doesn't happen very often. Sometimes like fragments are found or whatever, but it's pretty rare that it happens, but it's not common now that we find one of these books, sadly. So this is the big hope. The story about this is at Herculaneum, which is a town beside Pompeii that was covered by volcanic dust, which sucks for the people that lived there. But what it did, by a weird quirk, is seal off and preserve a lot of the buildings and materials. So it's a gold mine for archaeologists, right? And they found a building there. I heard the story was that when the archaeologists first found these lumps of kind of charred wood, like originally the guys that were helping them in the dig were setting fire to them. Maybe this is kind of urban mythos, but I've heard that the story was, and they were burning them. So they're like chunks of charcoal, and we're using them as like torches. And then someone noticed there was a piece of bone going through the middle, like, and it suddenly dawned on them, this is a scroll, like it looks like charcoal because it's been encrusted in volcanic dust for like 2,000 years or more. It's almost indistinguishable what it is. So we had these things originally. I think in the 19th century they tried to unravel some of them using a machine that moved very, 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 pulled them apart, teased them apart very, very slowly, but they disintegrated. And now they're hoping that with sort of scanning technology, so we have all of this, like all of these scrolls that are reduced to charcoal, if you can imagine that, but the writing is still in there, like but it's kind of fused together, like, so in theory we should be able to read this, but obviously it's really really difficult to extract. But also with AI, so if they can find like maybe just like fragments of the shape of a letter, they can use they need something like AI, some sophisticated computer software to try and kind of make educated guesses about what these squiggly lines, what letters they might have been.
Mhm.
So if you've got like a line here and a curve there and a line there and the rest of it's all disintegrated,
Yeah.
what possible words could that conceivably have been a fragment of? Like, and would that make sense next to the other words that are around? It's like doing a Sudoku or a crossword or something like that. It's amazing. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. It may be that we find lost works of antiquity. I really hope so. One day, we'll discover maybe more Stoic texts. And there are still fragments out there, like in other texts that haven't been fully documented. There's a lot of material from the ancient world. There's a lot of scholarship still left to be done. I don't think it's likely that in the next few years we're suddenly going to be handed, a lost masterpiece, though
Okay.
sadly. What we're more likely to get is like some fragments with chunks missing out in the middle of sentences, like of a
Speaking of
lost work of
Seneca,
Chrysippus.
speaking of Seneca and like tweets last summer, I was lucky enough, my family and I, we toured Pompeii, and there's graffiti on the wall, like a Seneca
Yeah.
quote. Like
Oh,
Seneca's,
really?
yeah. There's like something in Latin that's attributed to Seneca on a wall that was like
I didn't know
graffiti.
that.
Yeah.
That's
No.
amazing. Yeah, like how these guys influenced in the way that they crop out throughout history, the way they crop up is kind of amazing. Another thing I was going to say actually is this is a bit of a maybe this is a bit of a downer thing to say, but just being realistic about it. There are probably amazing works of classical literature that have been lost for all time. Oh, I mean, to put a rough figure on it, someone was arguing with me about this on the internet, but roughly, actually, I can say if I phrase it like this, I'm pretty sure that less than 1% of the literature that existed in the ancient world survives today. It's
Wow.
pretty safe to say. And in fact, even if we just said Stoic philosophy, less than 1% of the Stoic writings survive today. And we can say that pretty safely, I think. So that gives you a rough indication of what we're talking about. Now, are there going to be, there must be some masterpieces that of course there are. You might, we might also wonder whether the books that have survived may have survived in part because they were so good. I
Yeah,
mean, it's no
sure.
coincidence that we have all of the dialogues of Plato,
Mhm.
right? So those were preserved because people thought they were masterpieces, right? And it's the same with other texts. So there are other missing masterpieces, but don't be shocked if by some miracle we got the whole of classical literature. I wouldn't be shocked if you found that a lot of it was kind of disappointing, and maybe it turns out a lot of the best stuff we already had
Yeah.
because it was preserved. We have fragments of other Stoic writings in there. Like we have some lectures by Musonius Rufus that are really good. They're almost as good as Epictetus. But then we have fragments from another Stoic called Hierocles, and we have a book by a Stoic called Cornatus that still exists. And they're fairly, I like them because I'm a bit of a nerd about this subject, but by most people's standards, they're pretty dull.
Mhm.
Like they're not as practical or beautifully written as Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So might be we find that a lot of the Stoic texts were quite dry
Mhm.
compared to the stuff that comes down to us.
If you had to put a dollar on how the meditation survived, so Marcus dies out on campaign, right? Do you think they knew he had this diary, like, hey, when the old guy dies, we can't lose this? Or do you think it's a total accident that it was survived? What do you think?
Right, we don't know. So now we're guessing, but I don't have any problem playing guessing games about history. I think if I was Marcus Aurelius, so how would it survive? Like, first of all, probably he finished writing those notes about 5 years before he died. So, cut a long story short, based on internal evidence in it, most scholars believe he probably stopped writing those notes. I don't think it was like they were just on his desk, right? So Marcus retained these for some reason, right? Even though it looks like they weren't intended for publication, but it was common for educated Romans to write things and then just circulate them among their friends and family, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he'd written this stuff for some reason and then probably kept it for 5 or 10 years, kept it private. My best guess is that he would have given it to one of his family members, or possibly a teacher. Who would be most likely to inherit all of his stuff? It's fairly safe to say the most obvious answer would be Commodus. Would have, as he was also co-emperor, would have by default had ownership of everything that Marcus Aurelius had. I don't know what Commodus would have done with that. However, I've got a feeling that Marcus might have bequeathed it to someone else. Now, you think, well, if I was Marcus, I'd give it to a philosopher to look after, right? Would I let Commodus inherit this? Or will I hand it over to someone that I respect as a philosopher? Now, his problem is that he's either in Sirmium or Vindobona, like on the Danube frontier when he dies. And there probably aren't many philosophers around. So most of the philosophers that he knows would have stayed at Rome. Maybe they came occasionally. Perhaps some of them were philosophers and statesmen, but generally he left them behind at Rome, unless they also happened to be courtiers and they for some reason they traveled with him. Now, we're told that Marcus, on his deathbed, was visited by his family, including Commodus. But Commodus was not his only child. He had several daughters and he had several sons-in-law. So it's possible, for instance, that he gave it to Pompeianus, who was maybe his kind of second in line, or sort of to the throne next to Commodus, and Marcus had far more respect for him. But Pompeianus, as far as we know, wasn't a philosopher. He was a very experienced military commander. However, Marcus had another son whose name was Gnaeus Claudius Severus. He was his son-in-law, and he was also an Aristotelian philosopher. So it's quite, and I think he tended to accompany Marcus. So I'm just making an educated guess now, but for instance, I can imagine him doing something like taking these notes that he'd hung on to for 5 or 10 years and handing them over to his son-in-law that was a philosopher and saying, make sure that Commodus doesn't get his hands on these and look after them for me, perhaps. But that, we're in the realms of kind of fan fiction.
Yeah, it's just amazing it made it through. I wonder if or could have this been the one great thing that Commodus did, his contribution to history, like that one positive thing he did.
The one good thing that Commodus did. I mean, actually, maybe that's another thing that's worth mentioning. So when people ask about Marcus, they often say, well, his biggest, even Cassius Dio says his biggest mistake, the only criticism that people have is they say he shouldn't have appointed Commodus as his successor. And even though Cassius Dio says that, I disagree with him. I think appointing Commodus his successor might have been the least worst option. And I think what's missing in a modern appraisal of that is that in the eyes of Marcus, and even more so, I think in the eyes of the Senate, a bad emperor is better than a civil war.
Yeah.
And Romans, and under Marcus, they had a civil war. Not only did they have a civil war, the Roman Empire fragmented and split into Eastern and Western halves, but only for 3 months or so before it all fizzled out and it was resolved. But that's enough to scare the bejesus out of the Senate. Because to be clear, even if the Germanic tribes invade or the Parthians invade, and you have a terrible bloody war on your frontier, you're going to send a load of professional soldiers or legionaries. Yeah, there's going to be people that are out in the provinces that are conscripted and have to fight in it. But the people that live in Rome are going to be relatively unaffected by a war on their frontier. But civil war could tear apart the interior of the empire. In the civil war of Julius Caesar, Rome was evacuated. So he crossed the Rubicon, and seized Rome. So the whole empire could be torn apart. So the Romans were petrified of civil wars, and they'd suffered many incredibly destructive periods of successive civil wars in their history. And so they had a civil war under Marcus. It broke the empire in half. He managed to fuse it back together again. And I imagine the Senate went, we have to make sure that when you die, there's not a succession crisis. And I think Marcus went, well, I'd like to appoint not my son, but my son-in-law, Pompeianus, because he's a really experienced general. He's a great statesman. And I think, long story short, the Pompeianus himself allegedly and the Senate were, I suspect, would have been reluctant to do this because they would have thought, if we appoint this guy and your son is still alive, anyone that wants to stage a coup or an uprising is going to rally around Commodus. Rivals to the Roman throne don't usually survive that long. You can't have a wannabe emperor hanging out in the provinces somewhere or tagging on, because it's a recipe for disaster. So I think they maybe sat around and they thought, Commodus seems like a bit of a jerk, and this guy would be much better. But if we pass over Commodus and appoint someone else, it's going to create fractures in the political structure of the empire, and we run the risk of having another civil war. And if Rome breaks into fragments, then essentially it'll collapse. It may be that Marcus did the right thing by appointing Commodus. It may be the least worst option.
The least worst option. That is a good point. That's a point that you could see when you read the Roman histories. There's so much you say that they always wanted to avoid that civil war, right? That was always on top of their head, and you could see that's a really cool perspective. How about this? If you could have everyone listening take one lesson away from your new biography on Marcus, like one learning, what would it be?
I think Marcus, I thought, what is Marcus's journey? And in some ways, I think to me, I suspect it is a journey about anger. There are many references to anger in the Meditations. He opens the Meditations, the very first sentence says that he admired his grandfather for being free from anger. There's a passage later in the Meditations, book 11, chapter 18, where he lists 10 separate cognitive strategies for dealing with anger, 10 remedies for anger. He doesn't do that for any other problem. He says far more and more systematically about the remedies for anger than for anything else. And he also says, in a fleeting biographical reference at the beginning, he mentions that he has a quick temper and he's glad that he never succumbed to it in such a way that he did something like Hadrian that he might have regretted. So he refers to struggling with his anger. So I think the main lesson that we can learn from Marcus is perhaps, if he was a guy that struggled with and conquered his anger, today we live in a society that's got an anger management problem. The internet is full of divisive, aggressive. The media thrive on encouraging fear and anger. Social media is full of people trolling each other, flaming each other. American politics, in particular, is going through a phase where it seems to me people are gravitating more and more towards political extremes. Dialogue is broken down. There's more hatred, vitriol, and aggression towards people that hold opposing political views. And to the extent at which you have things like the riots in the Capitol, it was on TVs all around the world, right? Something people never thought they'd see and coming out of a news broadcasts from America. And we live in a culture where anger and hatred and aggression are thriving. And I also think that some of the self-improvement advice that people consume encourages it. There's a lot of bad self-help and self-improvement advice on the internet. I always pick on the same guy. I could pick on a lot of these guys, but I think the one that is safe to pick on is Andrew Tate. Who recently, there's a video that he published where he claims that he's influenced by Marcus Aurelius, and he's into Stoicism. But I don't have anything so much against Andrew Tate as an individual, but I think the advice that he gives, the self-improvement advice, encourages anger for a number of simple, easily explainable reasons. A lot of it is focused on blaming problems on external causes. So a number of these influencers put a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility. They say you need to make your bed and tidy your room and stand up straight and take more responsibility for your own life. But then they also employ a lot of rhetoric that involves blaming other groups of people in society, whether it's women or whether it's opposing political factions or whatever it is. There's a lot of blaming that goes on in the rhetoric of it, and a lot of anger like that's in there as well. Like, I mean, some of these guys are literally yelling down the camera at you and stuff, right? Like they're even modeling anger and like virtually spitting as they do it. So I think that even the self-help industry or self-improvement industry has become infected by this kind of political oratory or sophistry that fuels anger. And the Stoics really thought it was important to develop a remedy for that. Seneca wrote an entire book that survives today on Stoic therapy for anger. And so I think one big lesson would be that we need to be particularly cautious about anger. We need to be aware that anger is fueled by verbal manipulation and rhetoric. And it's in the interests of demagogues and political orators to do that, to make us angry. It makes us rubbish at social problem solving when we're angry. It impairs our problem solving ability. It's dangerous because people who are angry tend to, we know, have certain cognitive biases. So they typically underestimate risk. When people are angry, they expose themselves to danger and they expose other people, the innocent bystanders, to danger as well. Anger carries many risks. It's bad for your health as well, I'm told.
There's a great Seneca quote saying like anger is kind of like throwing a like hot coal at somebody or something like that. Doesn't Seneca have a great quote?
Burning yourself, isn't that what he says?
Yeah.
He says it's temporary madness as well, like, which is true. Because when people are angry, we know they exhibit many cognitive biases and they become much poorer at rational problem solving. We can measure these things. So yeah, anger makes you stupid. If you want to be stupider, like listen to people on social media who are telling you to blame other people, because it's a recipe for angry neurosis. And that brings a kind of cognitive bias, or if you like, stupidity. You want to be stupider than you are already. Listen to people that are yelling and stoking anger, because that's a good way, like, to impair your critical thinking skills. And so the Stoics want us to notice that happening, to be more mindful of it, to take a step back, to take ownership for the beliefs and attitudes and values that cause our anger in the first place, so that we can start challenging the beliefs and thinking that are making us angry. So that comes through mindfulness and philosophical critique of our own underlying beliefs, and it's not easy to do, but that's what the Stoics really want us to do, is to notice when our thinking is skewed and to take more care about the language that we use and the way that we employ reason.
I love what you said. Anger is temporary insanity. I think that's just a perfect way to describe it. Like I can't remember one time in my life I got angry and it was a good idea. Afterwards, you're so not disappointed. Anger always makes things worse. There was never a point in my life where I got angry and I was happy I did later.
What I find is that there are some people who believe that anger can be helpful. And actually, Aristotle is associated with this idea. Seneca critiques it. So they'll say, well, it gives you kind of energy and it kind of motivates you when you get really angry and worked up about things. But what I find is it's usually other people who are observing. When you're observing other people, you're less likely to think, yeah, I think it's really useful for those guys to get angry. Like, I can see how that's constructive. So I think be wary of that, because anger is self-righteous. And of course, when you're angry, you think this is helpful. It allows me to get stuff done. Like, it motivates me. But if you step out of your own shoes for a minute, That's not how you view other people's anger. You don't think, yeah, that anger's really helped that guy sort his life out. So, and other people are probably looking at you and thinking, that guy's anger is not really helping him. Like, so you have to in order to evaluate your anger, you have to learn how to step out of it. Like, because it's like a hypnotic trance.
Yeah.
Like, of course,
No,
it
you lose your,
feels justified. Like, Hitler and Stalin thought their anger was completely justified.
yeah.
Like, towards the people that they were persecuting or like exterminating and stuff. They felt like absolutely convinced that they were doing the righteous thing.
Hmm.
Like, so we've got to be wary of that. Anger makes you self-righteous. It makes you feel that what you're doing is justified. But it seems crazy when you look at other people thinking and acting that
Yeah.
way. Like, and they feel that when they're looking at you. Like, they think you're losing the plot.
Yeah. That's so true. How about this wrapping up on your book with Marcus? If you could describe the book in one sentence, what's the sentence?
It's a philosophical biography that allows you to step into the shoes and see the world through the eyes of the last famous Stoic of antiquity.
Wow, that is perfect. And I think that's a great spot to wrap up. But before we do, as you look out to the year ahead, what's the most exciting project you're working on now after the Marcus biography?
Well, I've just finished writing a book about Socrates that's similar to How to Thank the Roman Emperor, but it's about Socrates.
Oh,
And
cool.
it took a lot of research. So I'd say it was 4 times harder to write than How to Thank the Roman Emperor because I have to cover periods in history that are much more complex. Socrates is a much more complex figure. So it's hard. It was a hard book to write. I've just finished that. So I'll come out in October. And then the other thing that I'm working on at the moment is a non-profit that we set up about a year ago in Greece called the Plato's Academy Centre, which mainly at the moment runs online virtual events that are free of charge. So we're funded entirely through small donations at the moment. And it's a philanthropic project that popularizes practical applications of classical literature and philosophy. Our next event is in March, and it's about philosophy for children.
Mhm.
We've got some of the leading experts in that field speaking at it. I'm very excited about that. And but our long-term goal is to build an international conference facility at the original location of Plato's Academy in the middle of Athens. And that's something that we're working on. It's an ambitious goal, but we've got a lot of good connections in Greece. And we were lucky enough to get permission from the mayor of Athens office to do an event under marquee tents in Academia Platanos Park about a year ago, just over a year ago, with some leading philosophers at it. So we did that already, and we're doing another similar event in March, in April, sorry. It's a private event for a business, though. There'll be about 100 people at it. And what we hope to do then is to be able to do more public conferences and events in Athens at some of these amazing locations.
Yeah, oh, that sounds phenomenal. How about this last question? How do you think Marcus Aurelius would get along with Socrates? What would that dinner be like?
Well, Marcus, I think, really admires Socrates. At one point, he kind of questions whether we can really know what Socrates was like, actually. But he obviously, any ancient philosopher, the majority of them really revered Socrates. I think, gosh, I can't even really imagine what exactly it would be like. I think Marcus would have a lot of questions for Socrates about what his original method was really like, because we only get him filtered through Plato's dialogues and Xenophon's dialogues and one or two other fragments. So I think Marcus would want to go, what was the real Socratic philosophy originally really like? And obviously, the impression that we get is that Stoicism is something more of a kind of bullet point version of Socratic philosophy. The Stoics take these principles and then they apply them in practice.
Mhm.
Whereas Socrates had this more skeptical, dialectical approach called the Socratic method. and comes down to us in the dialogue form. So I think it might be we find the Stoics using the Socratic method. Epictetus still used it, so it may be that they used it extensively. But I'm sure Socrates used it. Socrates was the absolute master. He did it. He was like the Jimi Hendrix of the Socratic method, right? Jimi Hendrix, why will there never be another guitarist like Jimi Hendrix? I think one of the reasons is because we've got the internet and we have computer games and stuff. Jimi Hendrix went to bed with his guitar. Like he would wake up in the morning and fry eggs, and he'd still have his guitar strapped on. Like he went to the toilet and sat and played his guitar on the toilet. And so that level of total immersion in a discipline, is kind of rarer now because people have got
So many
Netflix to
distractions.
watch. Yeah, so many
So
distractions
many
and stuff like
distractions.
that.
Yeah.
And so Socrates, we're told, just did the Socratic method pretty much all day long. Every time he met somebody, he was constantly, employing these methods, asking them about justice. So I think Marcus Aurelius would probably look back and think, man, Socrates is like the Jimi Hendrix of the dialectical Socratic method. He's like, we use it. He lived it. He was doing it all day long every day.
That's so cool. How about this? How about we end this? Let's end on what is your favorite quote of Marcus Aurelius? Of all the research you've done, all the books you've written about him, if you had to think of a quote that defines him or he thinks the most thing that hits home the most, what's the Marcus quote?
I find, see, the more you know about a subject, I think, then the harder it becomes to kind of just pick. Like, so when people say that they're really, really, really into a band, then and someone says, "What's your favorite song by them?" You think, the more I know them, the harder it is to choose one. But I like. There's a passage where Marcus tries to condense the philosophy of Heraclitus and the philosophy of Epictetus into one pithy saying. And he says the universe has changed, life is opinion. And so the life is opinion part is him basically just saying it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. He's trying to condense that into as few words as possible. And the universe has changed is Heraclitus saying you can't step into the same river twice because it's always new waters that are flowing in. Everything is transient. So this idea of transience, and then the idea that our beliefs shape our emotions and the quality of our life. These are my two favorite things. And he compresses it in Greek. I think it's just like 6 words.
Not stepping in the same river twice, and like your beliefs shape your emotions. I mean, that's the whole human condition. And like you said, in 6 words there. I think that is about as good as a spot as any to wrap it up. The guest is Donald Robertson. His latest work, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor, his biography is out, available everywhere books are sold. Donald, I'd like to thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, one of my favorite books of all time. I can't wait to dig into Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. I appreciate you. When your Socrates biography comes out in the fall, we'll love to have you back on.
Yeah, it comes out in the fall. Awesome. Yeah, love to do that. Be great. Thanks very much. Been a pleasure.